everybody. Ryan, it's lovely to meet you. I'm so glad that we'll be able to chat about this topic that, for those who've followed me before, know that I'm very excited about it. So I understand you are as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I really appreciate it. Special thanks to Plato, Lohika for even making it possible for me to be here. This is a really sensitive topic. I think that it's important for all of us to address it. I think that it's very salient in the cultural shift that's happening today, right? Where we're trying to move engineers beyond just service providers, and we want to offer them the ability to be out there in the front, be creative, and really be a partner with product, right? Like, we want to make sure that all of our initiatives are product driven, and it also gets the voice of technology. And I think that vulnerability is actually the key here in strengthening a lot of those relationships. So really excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Totally. Well, I want to dive right in. You're already diving into it. It's great. So for folks who this is your first time, we have Q&A here that you can post yourself. If you have questions, we want to see them. And if you don't have questions, we want you to go to other people's questions and upvote them so that we can take from the top of the list the questions that are posed. So I already see a couple folks have already started putting in questions that they have on this topic. I highly encourage you to do the same, or at least upvote other folks. And with that, we'll buy you all a few minutes by just doing a kickoff here. Just Ryan, if you want to share us a brief background about yourself and kind of anything that folks might want to know, and then as it relates to this topic in the spirit of vulnerability, feel free to be as vulnerable as you want. And yeah, take it away.
I'll be the exposed nerve for everybody. So, I am I'm the CTO at Care.com. Care.com. I come from the parent company IAC, which had acquired Care.com back in February. It was such an amazing opportunity to be a part of Care.com and see exactly what they've been doing and how they've been championing care all of these years. And it was actually a really special topic for me because, I'm a father of two beautiful girls. One of them turns 3 today. So it is really exciting to be able to champion and build a lot of the services that will fundamentally power all things care. We want to create a safe space. We want to create an area where caregivers and care seekers can come together and they can feel confident that we've taken care of the platform. Everything is fine. Go about your business as you confidently would and safely would, right? Like, providing proper background checking, providing the proper payment services and tools for everybody to be able to communicate with each other and really grow together, right? Because we're in the business of supporting families at the end of the day. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I've been swan diving into the abyss as a CTO for the past couple of months. I actually come from the startup world. So being in this medium-sized business, I'll call it that, is somewhat new to me, right? It's a little bit refreshing. I say for all of those out there in the internets who are watching, if you've been a part of one startup in your life, I think that's good enough, and for those of you who have been part of 2, bless your heart. It is a soul-sucking journey. So, but fortunately I was part of 2 successful startups that, got to see it from seed round all the way through to acquisition. And now I'm seeing the flip side of it, right? Where, this is, big corporate, and, I'm really excited to be a part of this.
That's awesome. Well, I imagine that the culture of a company like Care.com, just by the nature of what you do as a business, probably differs from, let's say, the culture of like a gaming startup or a football. I don't know. I'm trying to make up a juxtaposition, but
yeah.
I don't know if I'm actually a little bit curious, like culturally speaking, if you find that because like the focus of the company is focused on families and improving families and allowing people to take care of each other, if that helps create like a culture where vulnerability is welcome where you currently are.
100%. Now, it's funny you mentioned gaming, right? Like that was my second startup. I come from the gaming space, and it is like it's like Best way I can describe it is sometimes it's like a warehouse, right? It's like a locker room. So sometimes you're not.
Like very broy or whatever the word is, right?
Yeah, it is definitely like locker room culture a little bit. Sometimes there's things that are said that we immediately regret as soon as it comes out of your mouth, and you're really trying to grab it and bring it back in. So there's a time and place for that stuff, and like I was glad to be a part of that culture and to learn, because I learned so much. But it is a complete 180, right? So when you come into a company like Care, the first question I asked all of the engineers was, tell me about the culture over here. I'm actually more interested. I don't necessarily care so much about the stack and what our pain points are in the stack. We'll get to that. We have, as long as I'm here, we have all of that time to figure that out. But getting to the heart of the culture was really important to me. And everyone here went down the line and everyone had the same message to say. They're like, we love it here. Like everybody over here, like we're open, we're honest, we're talking to each other. We don't have a problem. Like we love the teams that we're a part of, so on and so forth. So, my job now ended up being, instead of transforming the culture to be that, it's maintaining that culture, right? And again, a large part of that is being open, honest, transparent, vulnerable.
Got it. So I'm going to dive into the questions. This first unanswered question is probably the most common misconception as it relates to vulnerability, in particular vulnerability at work. I know that Brene Brown has actually talked about this particular thing. So this question is, vulnerability in my own case is seen as a weakness by the people around. How do you take this as a strength and keep your head or the heads of folks on your team high?
Yeah, I think it's perfect. So let's start with the definition, right? Vulnerability, to me, right, is the courage to be exposed. Okay, vulnerability is not a state of being; it is an act of bravery, right? In fact, it's funny because vulnerability is often considered that weakness. It is the opposite. Okay, It is much easier and safe to deflect and cover, but in my opinion, it's actually heroic and difficult to be transparent and unshielded, right? So being in a position of leadership, we're already out there in plain sight. We can't hide that. We don't have a choice in that, right? But how we control how transparent we are and we allow ourselves to be, that's our lever. Transparency is our lever to affect the type of team that we want to lead.
It's interesting because when I think about, because obviously I'm sure you've heard this many a time, kind of this like vulnerability isn't that weakness, what's the difference kind of thing. Like in a world where everyone sees each other in an adversarial light, or the people that you work with in an adversarial light, or your boss, or people on your team or whoever, but the people like within your own company, I could see how if you felt that way or if you felt threatened, that vulnerability could feel like it's weakness, right? Because it's like showing, it's having that bravery to show something that might reveal that, you're not a perfect individual. And at the same time, if you don't see the folks around you in an adversarial light, you see them in a friendly light. These are people that care about me. These are people that want the best for the company, that maybe want the best for me. I imagine that vulnerability is an opportunity for connection.
That's right.
I'm curious for you, like when thinking about, again, this idea of, it's like kind of the related question is like, why do it? What's the benefit? And I was kind of touching on, for me, one of the benefits, but I'd love to hear from you, what you found to be benefits on the job specifically of being vulnerable.
So let me be extremely clear, right? There is no right or wrong, right? How you lead, right? And there's a difference here. I'm being very specific in what I'm saying, right? There's leadership and there's management. Okay, I'm specifically talking about leadership, right? You can lead a closed off, focused, tactical powerhouse, right? Or you can lead an open, creative, strategic, dynamic unit, okay? That's the distinction, right? Management is a push. We can push pace, velocity, tickets, all day long. Leadership is a pull, okay? So our job is guiding people to that potential. right? Helping them realize that you can get there on your own, getting them to where they need to be, right? It's this concept of servant leadership that I'm sure many of you out there know. I've only just started learning it about like a year ago. It's about them. It's no longer about us. It's no longer about you, right? Your role is to do whatever it takes to set them up for success. So being vulnerable opens that channel for growth. So we need to learn from the team as much as they will be learning from us. So if we don't allow ourselves that opportunity to learn, to share, to own up to a bad decision, or just be wrong, we stunt trust, right? So if we commit to consistency, because this isn't just a one-time, one-and-done act, right? This isn't just a one-time deal. If you're in the boat, you need to commit to that same message time and time again, right? There's no days off for this. For my teams to grow, right, I need to be as vulnerable with them as they are with me daily. And I expect them to be as vulnerable with each other, right? So a really great example is owning up to the fact that from my personal life, right? Owning up to the fact that some of the responsibilities that I take on are actually way better off in more capable hands of my team, right? I have absolute killers on the team. And in this org, some of the things are actually in much better command. They would have much better command of certain situations than I ever would, right? So it's me understanding what's in my wheelhouse, being honest with myself, knowing, hey, this is where I can really provide value, versus, hey, you know what? I actually really suck at this. You know what? I have someone on my team that's amazing at this, or I have someone on my team who's really expressed motivation and interest to want to be great at this. Give them the opportunity, give them the shot, right? So that's how vulnerability can really start to open up those channels of communication.
So I hear two components. One, it sounds like, is really trust. You know, that when you are vulnerable, it enables people to trust you in a way that may be harder when you don't have that vulnerability. And I like to mention, and this is something I overquote this, but you know, so oxytocin, the trust and love chemical that goes through our brain as we're experiencing trust, and that we experience in family life, and there's all sorts of purposes for this chemical. But you know, that in human beings, oxytocin can be generated through, most commonly through one of two ways, and one is through physical touch, and the other one is through vulnerability. That when you actually share or expose something of yourself that is vulnerable, it actually creates oxytocin in the other person, which causes this reciprocity. It causes them to want to be vulnerable. And when you think about the importance of trust as a technical leader, right, like the people that you're entrusting to let you know when something is failing, even if let you know when they made a mistake and broke something, you know, like not hiding that stuff, you know, it seems like trust is paramount. So you know, that was one piece I heard. The other piece I heard was around essentially getting help, for lack of better words, like asking for help, knowing when somebody is really awesome at something and like will do something better than you, and being, it's funny because I certainly have encountered my share of leaders who, you know, don't expose the vulnerability, but also as a result kind of have this air or demeanor of like that they can do everything on their own a little bit. This also happens sometimes with new individual contributors going into a management role that have like a lot to feel like they have a lot to prove, you know, where like, you know, oh, I can do this, I can do that, and then actually end up, you know, not only maybe not doing the best thing, but also disempowering their team.
They don't scale, they burn out quickly, right? This is all recipe for disaster, right? Listen, I went through the same thing. There's an interesting book, Joel Beasley, I think he wrote this book called The Modern CTO. And in it, he starts off the book by saying, you know, I thought that I was unique. I was the powerhouse individual contributor that now has morphed into the CTO role. And as soon as I read that, I was just like, nah, man, like that's all of us. I think that's a lot of us. I think that it's actually the inverse, that, you know, they're to pull someone in who didn't have a technical background and, you know, elevate them to the role of CTO. I think that that's the exception to the rule, right? That's kind of like the edge case. And then further on in the book, he actually turns around and he's just like, yeah, I was totally wrong. It's actually the inverse, right? Like all of us are things. So my point being that I went through that same point, you know, very late in my career, in my IC career, right? I joke all the time to my team that I was like, hey, you know, I was once a celebrated engineer at one point, and they kind of laugh at me, and that's fine. But, you know, at one point in my career, I had my boss come to me and say, Ryan, you need to pick a path, right? Either you're going to stay down this road of IC, or you're going to be managing teams. I need you here managing teams because I need to scale you out. I can't have you sit there and do everything, right? You're gonna burn out. You're gonna, you know, die an early death. That's fine. I think that's fair. But I was resistant to that, and I fought that, right? And I kept fighting that. Look, you can't do something part way, right? Like a lot of us, we try to hold on to the IC role and say that I want to be a contributor and I want to do 50% of my effort here and 50% of my effort in management and leadership. Well, guess what? You're doing a disservice to both, right? Pick a lane and commit to it and go down it and learn, you know, like, believe me, there was a lot of fear in me because I was just like, I don't know how to do this job. Actually, funny story is that when I was originally approached for a CTO position a few years back, this was the first time I was approached for a CTO position. I declined it because I never saw what a real CTO looked like, right? Because again, I was in startup world, so I've never seen it, so I didn't know how they acted. I didn't have, you know, the luxury of reading all of these books to teach me what, you know, the concepts around it, not how to be one, but at least the concepts around it. And, you know, and I declined it because I didn't know what it was all about, because I was still so tunnel vision on getting the job done and being the architect and, you know, being able to whiteboard and so on and so forth. Some of these things, we got to let it go. It's got to be a bag of bricks because you're never going to scale. You know, a great team, you know, is only going to be as good as how you can lead them to it, right? Like, it's not going to be, you know, overburdening your strongest resource. It's going to fail every time.
Totally. And I mean, I'm sure many folks on this call found an opportunity for management because somebody came to them and said, we need more managers here. And, you know, somebody sees something in you that, you know, you could be an effective manager. Doesn't always translate to what somebody loves to do, right? Sometimes people are really good at something they may not necessarily love, right? So, you know, last week we had a good conversation about, you know, being a manager and then going back to being an IC, right? Like, that's still a choice. There's nothing wrong with that. You can still be just as senior, get paid just as much in many companies, right? So, you know, it's interesting, and you know, that journey that you experience of, you know, kind of being asked, essentially, right? Being asked to be a senior leader, being asked to be a CTO, and kind of not feeling ready for it. I can't help but be reminded of like something like fatherhood in that, you know, I mean, care.com, right? But I imagine, you know, it's like, yes, there are books out there that exist, but a lot of this stuff you just have to experience yourself and make a lot of your own mistakes, because reading about books, while it can be very helpful, it's not going to necessarily cause you to just make all the right moves the first time around. So I'd love to ask you this one. It's got a bunch of upvotes, and I have a feeling that this question spawns from, you know, what I was just mentioning around being vulnerable within your team, that like, if you don't see folks around you as adversarial, you know, then you see those benefits of trust and of being vulnerable to allow people to trust you and you trust them back, and it causes communication to get better, causes everything to get easier when everybody has all the elephants, you know, out on the table, you know, so to speak. But what about with external teams, right? So I imagine, I mean, Lohika, you know, who's sponsoring this event, right? They're an external team. I know a lot of folks use. The question is how important is it to be vulnerable with them, with external engineering teams? And would you open up as much as you would to an external team versus an internal team?
Yeah, I think there's two solid questions that we can answer there, right? One is, you know, how vulnerable should you be? The other question is, you know, again, how vulnerable should you be depending on the team that you're interfacing with? So I think both are going to be important, and let me take it in two parts. So, you know, is it possible to be too vulnerable? Let me just start there. And I think that, you know, leaders are there to inspire hope. They are there to drive towards results. So I think we need to pick and choose our spots, okay? Flex to the situation. So yes, the situation will surface where you need to adapt your style, right? And you need to be the leader that your team wants to be. Now, to what team as you start to interface with it? We are all one team. Remote, offshore, near shore, doesn't matter. You have to treat them the same. This is my opinion, right? Again, I treat them all the same from a personal standpoint. As an agency, do not be mistaken. I absolutely take full advantage of the benefits that offshore provides, right? Like there's certain markets where, you know, there are labor laws and stuff like that, and the agency actually absolutely helps you kind of navigate around those intricacies. So I take full advantage of it, but I don't penalize them either, right? I think it's a waste of intelligence. I think it's a waste of IQ to box them out, right? The more we bring them in, the more we keep them engaged, the more engaged they will be, right? Like there's very much churn that exists with offshore talent, right? We can't just bring them in and just dump a whole lot of shallow work, as I like to call it, on them and expect them to stay. That doesn't happen. Well, now you're putting all of this effort to train them up, getting them to do this work, right? There's a difference between shallow work and deep work. Ad nauseum, I say this to my team. I'm like, get away from the shallow work. Let's do deep work. But you can throw these things at them all day long, and guess what? Like after you train them up, they're going to be right out the door. Now you start this whole like chain reaction where you have to bring somebody else in, train them up now, treat them the same way. If we're constantly boxing them out, we're not going to win, right? There's the concept of standing together. So danger is a constant, right? Obviously, there's a whole bunch of dangers. Dangers outside, could be anything. When it comes to offshore, there's a danger of a bigger company coming in and poaching your best resources, okay? Or another business trying to steal your achievements, you know? Whatever it is, there's a ton of danger outside. Leader's job is to really make everyone feel safe in that workplace. We got to stand together, right? So we can be prepared to fight the dangers in the outside world. We don't have to be so concerned about the infighting, right? We don't have to be so concerned about the cancers that are eating away internally. If we keep everyone safe, if we put everyone in that giant circle of trust, go way out to the tips, even the most junior engineer or, you know, on your full-time team, and even your most junior engineer on your offshore team or outsourced team, you know, you need to bring them into the inner circle, right? And if the leader doesn't allow us a space to feel safe in our own company, to feel like we all belong here, well, then we're going to have to exert a whole lot of additional energy to protect ourselves from each other and all those dangers that are outside, right? So we have to treat everybody the same, in my opinion.
It makes a lot of sense. And so my takeaway is that internal team versus external team, either way, they're part of your team and you're building stuff together, and you'll probably benefit by treating them as part of your team, right? I certainly had this experience in my last role at CTOdoctor.com. You know, most of our engineers were a third party, and in Argentina, different culture, a lot of different things. Wonderful group. And, you know, obviously there are logistical things that make the situation unique, right? Like how and what folks get paid may be different, right, than folks that are internal. And those, you know, being vulnerable doesn't mean like showing what everybody's getting paid or like, you know, giving all the passwords out to the sensitive systems, right? You know, I mean, the whole point of this topic, right, it's more about like, again, emotional vulnerability and vulnerability in terms of interpersonal communication, vulnerability about emotions you're experiencing, stuff like that. So I completely appreciate your point, which is, you know, when it comes to the working relationship, set aside all that logistical stuff, you know, that the most effective way to work with an external team is essentially to treat them as an internal team. I'm kind of curious for yourself, you know, like whether it's been with Lohika or otherwise, like have you had a good experience with treating external teams as internal teams? Has that ever backfired, or has it been like the best thing for you?
Yeah, I in my experience, you know, I have 90% success stories, right? And I definitely have, you know, the edge case where there was a bad actor, right? That kind of bit me. Embedding the team, making them feel like they are part of the group, I've seen mostly successful results from it, right? And Lohika is a great example. We went through a very interesting phase at Care.com where, you know, we turned around and said, okay, well, we want to bring on a massive influx of engineers to come in and really expedite a bunch of these initiatives that we wanted to get out the door before the end of the year. Now, we went absolutely berserk, right? And you know, if you interview anybody else from the Care.com staff, they will tell you that it's been chaos, right? And it truly is, because we've essentially 2x'd the team overnight. We just brought in a bunch of resources to come on in, and really we're trying to train them up, getting them to be effective as quickly as possible. So getting them to be part of the team, and Lohika has been a great example, right? They staffed us up with about 40 engineers on the spot, okay? We immediately had to dive deep, and we had to say, all right, well, what is the value add here? What is the business goal, right? There's going to be a KPI or an OKR that's driving this reason. It's not just building technology just to build technology and have fun. You know, that's great. It's all fun and sexy, but you know, at the end of the day, we have to drive value. Getting Lohika to come in, immediately we realized, I'm like, they're asking all the right questions, right? Like they're coming in and they're not just sitting there taking orders and saying, great, you give me X on a mock, I'm gonna provide you X, right? They're coming by and they're saying, well, there's low-hanging fruit here. There's other opportunity, right? Let's continue to grow this out. And they were behaving much like other FTEs were, because we gave them the chance and we said, you know, hey, what do you think about this, right? Here's an area that, you know, we've been looking at for 13 years and we're kind of desensitized to the opportunities over here. What do you think? What do you see? And they're coming back with amazing results. We have other agencies that we work with that on a month-by-month basis, they present to me opportunities where Care.com can actually like improve their platform and like the efficacy of like their match rate, and you know they're introducing a lot of these like you know new algorithms that you know we want to possibly take advantage of. Like they're teaching me as much as I'm relying on them. So like they're not only just providing a service, but there's a value add there. There's a value proposition that they bring to the table. We just have to give them the chance to, you know, explore that and express that. The downside of it, yeah, of course, it did bite me before too, by strongly integrating somebody into the team. I'm not going to name names, obviously, but there was an agency out there where, you know, I strongly integrated 2 of their engineers into the team, and this is back in the startup world. So they became such a pivotal foundation for the team that the company took advantage of it, and they're just like, I'm going to pull these resources if they mean everything to you. So I'll pull these resources if not. That was a lesson learned for me. That's when I started to learn, oh, okay, there's redundancy here. Let me just, you know, the win the lotto situation. Let me just make sure if any of my engineers win the lotto, I have some backup and redundancy.
That's better than what I always say, which is getting hit by a bus. I like that. The lotto is nicer.
Yeah, I actually stole that from somebody else, my SecOps, my director of SecOps. He's just like, don't say the bus thing.
But you know, I don't know, some people win the lotto and they still need meaning and purpose and they continue to work. I hear you. So yeah, it sounds like, I mean, my general takeaway is, and this resonates for me as well from both Doctor.com and other folks, is the old way of interacting with offshore, if you will, is maybe to like be totally arm's length and have distance and kind of hand over contract over a fence. And really the new modern way is that you integrate. And of course, you know, you have to protect yourself and be responsible in various ways, but that largely, you know, that integration is, you know, that they function as part of the team.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong though, right? Like I want to be clear. The old way can still work, right? I'm not saying that, you know, it's only the modern way that works. You know, both ways can work, but again, it just depends on the type of team that you want to lead.
Right, and what risks you want to take on. Like we actually had absolutely no problem with Doctor.com having like literally our most senior resources, our most trusted resources to be this group in Argentina. And we knew that like, you know, if they all walked away, like that would totally screw the business. But it was a conscious choice that we made. And we actually, you know, you sweeten the pot by creating a stronger business relationship. And there are many ways to do that. But it worked for us, you know, so I completely get how it could work for you too most of the time and, you know, not always. So next question here, this is from Mark. How do you recommend balancing personal vulnerabilities with the requirements and expectations for taking personal responsibility as a leader?
Let me grok that question again. Yeah.
Yeah. The good news is we got it at the bottom, so you can reread it. It's when I think about like what's my interpretation of this question, I think about you know, when you're personally vulnerable at work, like sometimes you might, I mean, the easy version of this is to talk a little bit about your family, or actually it's not always easy, right? As a gay person, I can say that's not always easy, but for most people, it can be fairly straightforward to talk about your family, talk about kind of like a little bit of the life outside of your work or the reason why you were late in the morning and that sort of thing. And then there's kind of stuff like at work where, something maybe ticked you off or upset you, right? And your choice to either play it totally stoic or to say, hey, that thing frustrated me, So I think about that stuff. But the other piece of this is related to like when you make a mistake or you do something wrong, if you will, right? That, let's just say as a leader that you fired the wrong person, or you, who knows, made some kind of notable mistake. Taking personal responsibility is certainly a form of vulnerability. There's also, I imagine, some folks kind of wondering, like, gosh, like you could make yourself look really bad, and that could work against you. Like, how do you balance all these things? How do you know how far to go, and
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff, it really is around when you take any kind of leadership training course or something along those lines. They really do preach around flexing to styles, and you need to really do that on an individual basis. You can't just do that on a holistic team basis. It's got to come back down to the individual and understand what the limits are, right? To be able to say, well, how do I flex to your style? You might be a very specific personality type. And, I need to be able to gauge my response to you. And this is a constant thing, right? And it's kind of like, when we start talking about trust, there's a level of trust that we need to build up within the team. So the first thing in vulnerability, I think, it's to really help define what trust should mean to the team. I think there's a great book out there, again, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it really defines trust as not just in the classical sense of like, hey, this is a past experience. Like, oh, I trust this person because they do solid work and I can give them this work, right? Like past tense stuff. Instead, it defines the term as, being respectful of the vulnerabilities and the fact that those vulnerabilities are not going to be used against you, right? So rule number 1 is understanding that definition, right? It's actually an unforgivable sin on my team and it's immediate grounds for being removed from the team if you try to exploit your teammate. So we want to try to increase vulnerability amongst the team, right? But like, sitting there collectively and saying that, well, what's a really great exercise? Back when things were normal, it would be simple as like a team lunch or an outing, right? Where we can actually, open up a little bit more, have a coffee break, have a drink, have lunch. Nowadays, we're in the Zoom world or the virtual world, right? So we have to be a little bit more creative. So one way to figure out how to flex the styles is by holding those one-on-ones. Hold that one-on-one and take the first 10 to 15 minutes of it to learn more about their families, to understand them a little bit. Talk about yourself, but really ask them questions. Talk about their kids, their pets, previous jobs, personal hobbies, something like that. Some of the stuff that's very okay to ask, right? Ask your HR what's in the wheelhouse of what you should ask and what you shouldn't, right? But it's really easy because I think there's a dirty secret here that people really do like to answer questions when someone shows genuine interest about them. That's going to help you understand your gauge and your level, right? Like you're going to understand, well, how willing is someone to be open to accept, your transparency versus not. And we do need to flex styles. It's not about being dishonest with yourself or fake to yourself, but it truly is about, well, how do I put them in a position where they're most comfortable, right?
Yep. The thing that I'm reminded of as you were talking is I think we've all seen leaders out there in the world, none to be named, who don't always take responsibility. And when you think about, your personal reflections or impressions of what happens when that's the case, at least for myself, I see that as a negative sign, and it makes me more resistant to taking responsibility myself, right? But when I see a leader taking responsibility for something, actually, we just saw this really recently, in California, Gavin Newsom talked all about like wear masks, not going political here, not to go too political, but he went out to, French Laundry and had this fancy meal. And he was like, oh, I should have worn a mask and everyone's mad at me. And he was like, hey, I'm sorry. Like I should have worn a mask. I did the wrong thing. And, that's an example of where you have a choice, right? To like be vulnerable and basically, admit fault and kind of take on responsibility, or, try and paint a picture of, here's the reasons why it wasn't violating blah, blah, blah. And the ironic thing that happens with taking responsibility is that usually when you accept it, and sometimes even slightly over accept, in other words, like maybe you don't think it was quite as bad as other people say it, but you just take responsibility for what is, and if people perceive it bigger than what it is, like you just still roll with it. That in those situations, oftentimes people respect so much the taking of the responsibility that they're ready to move on to the next thing and to let go of it. Whereas, when you have that resistance, when you have that wall, when you create a defense that actually it causes people, a saying I like is what you resist persists. That sometimes that can persist.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it kind of ties into, this concept of like, look, sometimes it's like a bag of bricks. You just gotta let it go. You just gotta let it go. And then building that culture that understands that. It's like, look, let's understand the situation. Let's have our retrospective around it. Let's talk it through. Let's have a healthy debate about it, right? Conflict is not a bad thing, right? By no means is it a bad thing. Let's talk it out. Let's understand exactly what happens. If I made a bad choice, I made a bad choice, right? We're a data-driven culture. This is the world that we're living in. We're holding each other accountable, right? Don't make excuses. Don't play favorites. Fight for excellence, right? All of those great concepts, right? If you see something wrong in a pull request, like don't let it slide. Confront it, right? Start getting into the habit of having potentially uncomfortable conversations. The more this is practiced across the board, the easier it's going to become, right? And it's kind of like a giant boulder on a plane, right? Like we can't rely on much momentum. Right? It has to be a way of life, right? So if we let up on holding each other accountable for these things, even for like a sprint, we're gonna backslide, right? And it's like the point of this is full transparency. So if you're afraid of being in the spotlight, it could mean that you actually do have something that you're scared to have exposed, right? It's a cue to emotional resilience, putting yourself in the spotlight, being transparent a little bit, right? And what if you're holding yourself back from an incredible learning moment? Right. So, what if the feedback or that constructive criticism is your launch pad to unlock a whole new level for you? So the point here is not to call you out or to take you down a peg. The point here is for everyone to raise their game by relying on each other.
100%. I'm always reminded of Google doing this study several years back about, the top 5 indicators of team success. And the number 1 indicator was psychological safety, right? Yeah. It's one that can't be talked about enough because people, particularly, engineering leaders who are focused on very technical things and getting things done, where sometimes our list of things to do can seem very cut and dry. It can be very easy for us to forget about the humanity that is driving all of this stuff, and that whether we like it or not, as logical as we think we are, humans are driven by emotions. Like even the most cerebral of us, we're driven by emotion. So, I very much appreciate the sensitivity to this. We got about 15 minutes left, so I want to continue with some of the questions. This one from Yidner, are there any metrics on how you measure the success of vulnerability in your teams?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. So yes, in a very specific way, I think so, because vulnerability or trust, as we, I don't want to interchange the two, but they're related. There's a lot of synergy there. That's the foundation to having a really solid team. So I think it's kind of like a down trickle, and it goes upstream again, where you have, the concept of trust, open communication, which leads to the trust, which leads to the empowerment, which leads to the ownership, right? So I think that what we need to do as leaders is understand the leadership matrix, right? The John Adair leadership matrix, if you will, right? To say that, well, how deep in the weeds are we? How much do we have to, tell versus sell versus consult versus empower, so on and so forth. So, I think a lot of it comes down to your personal time, right? Like how deep in the weeds do you need to be for these things? Because if you have a fully functional operating team that's doing the right things, that's vulnerable, they're having the right conflicts, they're having the right communication, you've done your forming, your storming, your norming, your performing, so on and so forth, you'll be able to gauge the success of the team because they will be able to be more effective and efficient, right? Because again, trust being the first thing. Without trust, you can't have conflict. If you don't have conflict, you can't commit to anything. Right? If you finally do commit to something, then you can hold each other accountable for it. And then finally now you aim at that goal, and whatever that goal ends up being, but now you have metrics. And again, it's business driving metrics at the end of the day. So you'll be able to see how dysfunctional your team really is at the end of the day if they're just not performing, and how much it affects your day to day.
So my impression of that is that there doesn't have to be a separate set of metrics to track to measure, how the vulnerability is doing, but that the results manifest in all of your other KPIs, in the goals of the team being achieved, in the team actually following through with the work that they're doing. And that resonates with me. The other thing I reflect on is maybe kind of the opposite, which is, are there metrics of failure? And that's where I actually think there are, right? These very clear signs that the vulnerability isn't there, right? When I think of the most significant one, tell me if this resonates with you, is silent failures, right? Silent failures where somebody broke something and nobody said anything, or silent failures, actually even in the code base, right? So this is an interesting one as a programmer, right?
Yeah.
I faced this myself, and I'm sure you have too. As a programmer, you're building something and you're catching exceptions and error handling, right? Isn't it interesting the choices that we make when we do our error handling for the things that we built? Because in a culture where vulnerability is welcome and trust is welcome, you will find a willingness to have errors throw, let's just say, emails that get sent to people, or errors that throw an alert, right? But isn't it interesting how sometimes you encounter cultures where maybe things don't feel quite as safe, where exceptions just get logged to a file that never gets read, or exceptions get ignored, like the catch-all, the dreaded catch-all for all exceptions or something, right?
That's right.
It's so when I think for myself, how can you tell if things are going well? Well, maybe it's not as straightforward. Maybe it's just seeing that things are going well. But how can you tell when things are going wrong? See how the failures are being handled. Does that resonate with you?
100%. I mean, you obviously we don't do our entire stack dump in the error log, but and bubble it up to the end user. But it's how we perceive the task, and how much, I want to say, pressure is on us to just get something out the door, so on and so forth. But it does resonate with me. I mean, we saw, me personally, I saw a great incident where vulnerability failed, right? And it was on my part. This was a huge lesson to me. And I call it the we all lost incident, right? And I'll dive into that. This goes back a few years back, and there was a serious breakdown in communication. I was sitting here watching two different teams competing just to get through the conversation rather than actually listening to each other, right? Recipe for disaster. We all know it. We can see how it plays out. First, on the communication breakdown, we had yet to build that basic foundation, open communication and trust, right? So two groups are just talking past each other. It's a breakdown for a number of reasons. Number one, we talked about culturally, right? We all work, we try to extend out the development day. We try to be, we try to have some kind of development happen in different time zones, which means different cultures, right? One side wasn't accurately presenting their argument. There was a lack of command and control in the language and their presentation, right? So the other group was, they were essentially so focused on proving the initial group wrong, they didn't even get to the heart of the matter. They didn't even understand the underlying motivations or the fears, right? And it's important to touch on motivation, right? And drive. So it's, we how do I put this simply? It's just we may know the story that, back in the 1940s, brilliant psychologist named Abraham Maslow, right? I quote this guy constantly. Maslow broke us down into 5 basic tiers of human motivation.
Hierarchy of needs.
Hierarchy of needs, exactly right. So you have your basic needs, the physiological, right, and safety. It's food, water, a good night's sleep, shelter, and security. Then you have the psychological needs. It's a sense of belonging, a sense of recognition, right? And then finally you have this pinnacle tier called self-actualization, where you basically realize your full potential and you have the power of flight, right? So it's this amazing realm that we all strive to get there. But if we step back a little bit, it's that middle tier. Most of us are hovering in that psychological zone, right? The sense of belonging, sense of recognition. Much like the groups that we're sitting here battling it out, right? they were both fighting for that sense of belonging and recognition. They didn't even realize it. This is a new team, right? They're just forming. So, instead of joining forces and working together and coming towards like a common goal, they're fighting to see who sits on top of the food chain, right? It was very much borderline Children of the Corn scenario, right? And the second undertow here is fear. So we really broke it down. The way I was listening, because I'm sitting there as a silent observer here, I'm breaking down the arguments being made, and I'm boiling it down to basic things. It's like, hey, if I was to interpret what the user is saying or what the resource is saying, I'm scared to commit to X because I don't understand it. Or please help me grok how this is going to satisfy my responsibilities to Y. Unfortunately, it was never said like that. It wasn't put in those simple terms. And the reason is because it takes an awful lot of courage to come out and just say it so simply, right? Like, I'm not saying that these resources were cowards. I'm just saying that, we never established that level of trust for us to be vulnerable in front of each other, right? So you see vulnerability is not just being about open. It's going back to what I was saying before. It's having that trust in your peers that they won't use this weakness against you. Great teams are never going to hold back from each other, right? They're going to fearlessly put each other out under the microscope because everyone is allowing themselves that same level of scrutiny. So when you let your guard down on vulnerability, you open yourself up to freedom, constructive conversation, healthy conflict, right? But none of that can happen without trust. So we saw no evidence of this, obviously, right? There was no healthy conflict because everybody was just saying, hey, let's just get this conversation over with. And they were just fighting. The second recipe for disaster, right? Like I said, conflict isn't a bad thing, right? We have to be okay, keep it constructive and professional, but we have to encourage that healthy debate. How can you ever get there if you're afraid of being uncomfortable, right? It sucks. Sometimes it sucks to hear that your idea was terrible. But we all need to approach it the same way. We're all working.
And there are tactful ways to deliver that kind of information that doesn't cause people to shut down,
That's exactly right? It's a team accomplishment because we have to get rid of, the ego. We got to say, hey, it's no longer about us. It's the team. The team comes first. So like back to the metrics again, it's like, that's where it's going to resonate. So as leaders, sometimes we have to let that conflict breathe. It's okay, right? Like when you hear words like, hey, let's take this offline, believe it or not, that could be a killer. Right? I understand like maybe it's derailing a specific meeting, but if you need to get to, a specific direction, navigate through that conflict, let it fester, right? Help them guide to that resolution. Goal here isn't for everyone to agree, it's to have everyone commit. So ultimately, like, what's the point of the story? It's like my retrospective here is I was too involved in the conversation because again, I'm an engineer at heart, right? Much like most of you. So like, I'm sitting there, I was so focused on trying to find the solution instead of zooming out and listening to the team and helping them solve the problem. Like my role in that meeting, it should have been an observer, not, instead of just being a moderator and like being a participant. I needed to be observing. So I needed to be examining them from that forensic lens. I needed to understand the motivations, the intents a little bit more. I needed to listen to those subtle cues. Maybe I could have had a chance instead of uncovering this weeks later, So it's really interesting situation, like being able to train teams up to deal with that level of being uncomfortable.
100%. I find sometimes in those, certainly been in that kind of conflict environment. Sometimes if you have an environment where people are capable of being vulnerable and they're not showing it, sometimes just like if your only role is to surface the elephants in the room in a tactful way, so that those uncomfortable conversations can be had. Sometimes that's all you got to do. You don't even need to provide the solutions. People resolve these things themselves. So we have about 3 minutes and I want to do a little bit of a mini lightning round here. So kind of like the 30 seconds or less if you can for a few of these questions. What is the number one way, not to put you on the spot, you propose to be vulnerable to your engineering team? This person, John, says, I lead a team of 16 mechanical engineers, for context.
Yes. Okay, great. So tips to being more vulnerable. Number one, define what vulnerability means, right? Again, great exercise. Again, get to know one another, talk to them, right? Another step towards vulnerability is going back to the floor. If you have 16 engineers, right, as they call it, right, you make your way out to the tips of the org, get a feel, get an understanding of what they're actually working on, right? Are they so busy with deep work or shallow work or whatever? Get a sense for how much effort is going into that. Go even to your most junior member, right, and talk to them and make them feel part of that inner circle. Again, along those same lines, hold each other accountable. don't make excuses. Don't play favorites. And then leaders, as leaders, we need to kind of risk it all. Okay, so I hope my teams will tell you this. You know, I'm 100% transparent. There's no faster way to lose everyone's trust than the fake vulnerability. Okay, so more often than not, I have to come to them, come to the team for the answers, and I got to tell them, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm going to need everybody's help. Display your weakness. My weakness is on full display. I don't try to hide it. I'm an overly passionate person at times, you know, and there's moments where I'm totally impatient and I just make a good call instead of waiting to capture more data and make a call on something. But that's where my team comes in and there's like, Brian, pump the brakes. So, you know, there's quick hitters here for how to be a little bit more vulnerable.
There you go. One of the other reflections I have is, as a technique where that's been most useful for me with vulnerability, is anytime that you want to state a fact as it relates to something you're trying to do, just mentioning your emotion prior to the fact. You don't even have to go into detail, right? One of these questions here is talking about a concern about being perceived as too emotional, right? It is possible to deliver your emotion without being emotional, you know? Like right now, like I'm slightly nervous being on camera talking to a bunch of folks, you know? I don't need to say that in a nervous way, right? But I'm vulnerable, and how much do you like feel closer to me now that I'm being vulnerable with you, right? It's just these little techniques like that, and you can have the exact same conversation, you know, like, you know, somebody did, you know, poor job, you know, in a pull request, right? And you say, you know, I feel disappointed because, and then say all the things you were going to say, right? And you don't have to be like, I'm disappointed. You know, it is possible to convey without being emotional. We are, yeah. I want to keep going, but we're out of time. I mean, I love this topic. I love your perspectives on it. And also, you know, I'll be honest, like even for myself, talking about vulnerability, I find that it's a very accessible topic for when I talk with women, when I talk with other gay men, it is not always so accessible for everybody else. And so I appreciate you sharing, you know, you're a guy with a family who works for a company for which, you know, it's about taking care of families, and you're sharing, you know, your perspective on vulnerability. And, you know, I think it's certainly, I perceive you to be strong and courageous, you know, from your expression of these things. So I imagine that others perceive the same. So with that,
I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. Look, you know, practice. We just have to practice it, right? It's not a light switch. We're not just going to turn it on and all of a sudden be amazing at it, right? To your point, David, you know, we can label things, we can express our vulnerability without being, you know, overly emotional. Some of us are overly emotional, right, by nature. So, you know, I'm talking with a lot of hand motions and a lot of frowns and smiles. So
animation can be charismatic at times.
That's right. But this was great. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to Plato and Lohika for making this happen. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.